Hello everyone. My name is Sarah Pate, and I'm a librarian and the director of the Washington Center for the Book, an affiliate of the Library of Congress Center for the Book, administered by Washington State Library. The Washington Center for the Book promotes literacy and a love of books, reading, and libraries. And one of our projects is the Washington State Book Awards, and we're thrilled to have you here with us to celebrate 2024 Washington State Book Award winner Timothy Egan for his book, A Fever in the Heartland, a historical thriller by this Pulitzer and National Book Award winning author that tells the riveting story of the Klan's rise to power in the 1920s, the cunning con man who drove that rise, and the woman who stopped them. And we are so pleased to be partnering with the Seattle Public Library this evening for this event. Originally, we had planned to have journalist, writer, and Washington State Book Award judge Marcus Harrison Green with us this evening, but Marcus is unfortunately unable to be with us due to unforeseen circumstances. But in good news, we have Marcus's colleague at The Stranger, Hannah Murphy Winter. Murphy Winter is the editor-in-chief of The Stranger in Seattle. Before that, she was an editor at Rolling Stone magazine, and she's the author of Queer Power Couples on Love and Possibility. Thank you for being here, Hannah. Welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to start by introducing Timothy Egan. I'm sure he needs no introduction, but for those of you that are still catching up, 2024 Washington State Book Award winner Timothy Egan is a lifelong journalist. He worked as a national correspondent and opinion columnist for the New York Times, roaming the West. As a Times correspondent, he shared a Pulitzer Prize in 2001 with a team of reporters for its series, How Race is Lived in America. A graduate of the University of Washington, Mr. Egan is a third-generation Westerner and a father of two. He lives in Seattle, a city that loves writers, and honored him once by naming May 12th a day in his honor. Alas, no exemption from parking tickets. Timothy, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Oh, it's wonderful to be with you and Sarah and Hannah. Thanks for stepping in at last minute. We'll all miss Marcus. Hopefully he's at home following us through the windstorm.
Yes, and of course, we are carefully watching a storm coming in, so we are holding tightly to our Wi-Fi and hoping to get through this without any trouble.
Yeah.
All right, so I'd love to dive in to talk about your book. So this is a question that's come up a lot in media that's coming out in this moment in time where much of what we were producing 6 months ago, we weren't imagining that we were going to be in this particular 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, we weren't imagining that we were going to be in the position that we're in now, necessarily heading into a new Trump administration. But so the context of this question might change a little bit, but I'm curious why telling this story feels important right now. What drew you to it, and why do you think it resonates so strongly in today's political and social climate?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. My power is blinking now, so I hope I'm going to stay with you guys.
Ours blinked a little bit as well. We're holding on tightly.
You write these stories, I write histories, journalists tell stories because you want to say something new. And I heard this quote from Harry Truman where he said, "The only thing new in this world is the history we do not know." And this is a history I would wager most people did not know. Because you think of the Ku Klux Klan, America's oldest domestic terror group, as being a bunch of, toothless rubes in the South, or, terror group that's going around, firebombing people, and had their two reigns of the 1860s and 70s and then the early 1960s. But in fact, their peak was 100 years ago, in the 1920s. And I saw so many parallels to today, mainly that, certain that, we can fall for a con man. At the core of this book is a monster, a villain, a rapist, a raging alcoholic, a bootlegger, a serial liar, and he ran the entire state of Indiana. This guy was like a music man of hate. And so, my eyes were just popping out as I was looking at this history because there were so many parallels. And I'm one of the believers in the line that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. That you hear certain echoes from the past and they sort of course through us. They go into dormancy and then they come back out again. So first and foremost, I was attracted to this because I thought it was a new story, new to most Americans. I mean, did you know about it? Did you know about the Klan's rise in the 20s?
No, and especially not in Indiana, like in the Heartland. I think the regional difference was also what was surprising to me.
Yeah, no, that's exactly how I felt. I mean, now,
Yeah.
so I'll tell you the genesis though. I had always heard in all my research going back to my very first book, The Good Rain, about the Klan in Oregon.
Hmm.
Because Oregon, when they became a state, actually kicked all the blacks, such as they were, out of their state. They were sort of early, racist-based state. Um, and in the 1920s, they had a Klan governor. They had a mayor in Portland who was Klan sympathetic. And I found all these pictures of the, Chamber of Commerce hosting a luncheon with the chief of police, the mayor, and like five guys in hoods. And there says Klan has plans for Oregon. And they passed a resolution outlawing Catholic schools because Catholics were mainly immigrants. And that was the way to get at immigrants. So I was going to do this story about Oregon. And I was going to be like, I'm a lifelong Northwesterner, as you mentioned. I think our region can and will be different. It's trying to set a different course than the rest of the country, but it has historic history, and that was the Klan period. But I start digging around Oregon. I go, holy cow! I mean, it's nothing compared to Indiana, where one in three, that's 300,000 men, white males, put their hand on a Bible and swore to forever uphold white supremacy. One in three. And who were these people? Were they criminals? Were they, rejects? No, they were like merchants, coaches, ministers, business owners, journalists. Some probably worked with a stranger. I'm sorry. They were the rank and file of Indiana society. And in
Right.
fact, they felt if you didn't join, you were missing out on something. So that's how my story brought me to the Heartland. And so thank God there's an Alaska Airlines flight that goes direct from Seattle to Indianapolis because I was going back and forth and back and forth. And this is during COVID. It's like, oh,
Oh,
just what I want is to study, like the darkest period of hatred. But there's really terrific lessons there. And let me just say on the positive side, it's a hard story. It's a very, very hard story about hatred and murder, actually. I mean,
yeah.
the woman who's at the center of this thing pays with her life. But I didn't know how this book would be received because it's a hard story. It really is. And this book has been hugely well received. I mean, it was a New York Times bestseller. And even in Indiana, it sells like crazy. So that gives me hope that people, we've had this debate over how to face our history, that people aren't afraid to face this history.
That's really interesting. Yeah, you've talked about being really well received by audiences in Indiana as well, which is really striking to me. Um, I also think that, a lot of what you talked about here really resonates with this idea that it's a lot easier to talk about groups like the KKK when they feel really separated from us.
Right. That's
Um,
that's the point.
and it's so, so important that we recognize that they were in Oregon, they were in Washington, they were in Indiana. They were not just in these, they were not, this ideology wasn't sequestered in the South. And
Let
your
me
book,
just interrupt for 1 second. Colorado elected a Klan governor the same year, 1924. And you know what his motto was? Every man under the Capitol dome a Klansman. He was an open Klansman. That was his motto. And he got elected. And then he tried to
that was
fire.
a that was a winning campaign.
Exactly. It wasn't hidden. They're called the Invisible Empire, but it wasn't hidden. And then he tried to fire every Jew, Catholic, and Black who worked for the state. So I'm sorry I interrupted, but yeah.
No. I mean, this is exactly what we're talking about. To kind of pivot from that just a little bit, I'm curious, you talked earlier about seeing some parallels to our current times, and you wrote about the Klan's strategies, specifically about exploiting fear, controlling institutions, and promoting exclusionary ideology, much like only a Klansman under the dome. But did you see in this work, particularly in those strategies of control, did you see parallels to current political movements?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do with this book was to give a sort of tick-tock of how it happened.
Yeah.
So you could go back and see step by step how this quintessential American state turned itself over to our oldest domestic terror group. And don't ever forget, they are a terror group at heart. They're about killing, burning, othering, lynching, all of that they did, okay, while being kind of a Mayberry Klan. I always say, don't ever lose sight of that, even though it was the golden age of these men's clubs, and they were like the greatest of the secretive men's clubs. So I tried to do a TikTok, sort of a blueprint, so you could look at this thing and say, how the hell did they do this? And it was sort of a threefold thing. done by this brilliant con man who ran the state, the Grand Dragon, who's the monster who's at the center of the story. The first thing was he won over the Protestant ministry. So he started bribing preachers to preach the word of hate from the pulpit on Sunday. And the word of hate was that these others, these Jews who were coming to America in great numbers, these blacks who were moving north from the south during the Great Migration, these Catholics who were coming in the form of new immigrants from Sicily and Eastern Europe and places where they seemed unrecognizable to the older Americans. It was the othering of those people that he got white Protestant ministers. He bribed them. They were an easy mark. He paid them like $75, $100 in then money, which is about $1,000 today, to go and preach the word of hate. Before long, he had hundreds of ministers preaching the Klan virtues. So it's very important. He got the Klan sanctified. Instead of being a terror group, they had the imprint of God on them. Okay, number two, he had his own militia. It was called the Horse Thief Detective Association, which was designed to go after horse thieves, but it stayed on the books in Indiana, and you could be deputized to do any damn thing people wanted you to do. So he had 30,000 men who would go into speakeasies where people were listening to black jazz and break up these clubs, and they would go out with their little flashlights at night looking for teenagers who were necking in the cars, as they used to call it, necking, you know. And so they were the morality patrol. They were like the Taliban light. And their job was to go out and enforce Klan morality. And they did it with badges, which is rather astonishing. Now, I like to point out, my grandmother here in Seattle was a flapper in the jazz age. And she used to tell us tales about going out to Lake City Way, which was then the edge of town,
Yeah.
and spending all night in a jazz club. And she said it was the time of my life, you know, listening to jazz, drinking bathtub gin. She was a flapper.
Yeah.
That freaked the Klan out as well, because women were socially liberated. They had the vote, remember, in 1920, and now they were socially liberated. A huge extra step. They were saying, I don't need a husband necessarily. I'm going to go to the jazz club with my grandmother and dance all night. That freaked them out. And that's why they had this morality patrol. So that was the second thing. And then the third thing, and this is crucial to understanding how the Klan could take control of a town, they compromised the press and the judiciary and the cops. So we think of these three guardrails as we're looking at even going into a second Trump administration. Will our guardrails hold? And that's usually what I look at. You know, the police will form basic laws of the land. The judiciary will back us up when somebody breaks those laws, and the press will alert us. Well, in all three of those, they failed.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm curious specifically about using fear. And I think that that's something that we see. It's an immensely effective strategy.
It is.
And I think if you could dig in a little more into that, because I think that that's such a strong through line from movement to movement to movement, is harnessing
Yeah,
the average person's fear to kind of overcome their good sense.
right.
And I'm just curious if you could explain a little more how that played out here and what we might be able to learn from it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because Indiana is a really homogenous state. It was homogenous then, it's homogenous now. It's basically white Protestants.
Yeah.
There aren't a lot of blacks there. The black population is, I think, last I checked it, about 5%, but at the time it was about 2%. There aren't a lot of Jews there. Their
Right.
Jewish population was about 1%. There weren't even a lot of Catholics, which is another 20s target of the Klan. But it was the othering of these people, the fear of them. So Jews were coming to America in huge numbers, fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe. We'd never had quite this wave of them. And they were like, oh, they're different. You know,
Right.
they worship a different God. They're clannish. So they're going to come to Indiana. And again, you can't understate this part of it. 200,000 blacks had fought for their country in World War I, in the Great War, World War I. They come home and they can't be full citizens because Jim Crow is the law of the land. They're really pissed. These are 200,000 veterans who fought for their country and they can't be citizens. And this guy says they're coming to Indiana. They're going to want, you know, to live in your neighborhoods. So they had these white neighborhood councils that made sure in places like Indianapolis and even Bloomington, where the college is, that blacks couldn't move into their neighborhoods or into their schools. So Jim Crow came north. And all of this was based on, as you said, Hannah, a fear, a sort of vague fear that they're going to change our way of life, that they're going to come to our town, with, in the case of Catholics, with their loyalty to the Pope and all the booze that's associated with it. It's one of the reasons the Klan was behind Prohibition. Irish were heavy drinkers, and their gathering spots were pubs. And if you take away liquor, you take away the place where they can go become citizens. Italians brought wine with them, and a lot of them brewed wine. If you take away liquor, you take away, social cohesion. So Klan was really big behind Prohibition. And that's one of the things that the group did. But as it relates to today is that if you can other people, if you can make them somehow less, it starts with making them less American. And a step down that road is ultimately they're less human. And one more thing in this regard, Indiana invented American eugenics. They passed the first involuntary sterilization law, later adapted by 25 American states. And I don't use Nazi analogies, but later adapted. The Germans said they got their eugenics law from Indiana. And what this did is it allowed them to sterilize upwards of 10,000 people. And who were they sterilizing? Gays, promiscuous women, people who were thought to have drank too much. They had sort of, they would have these, they wouldn't even have judiciary hearings. They would just single people out and involuntarily sterilize them. So the othering went from hatred, fear of others, to actually doing something about them, depriving them of the right to ever have children.
Wow. Well, that seems like actually a really good transition into your central character. So looking at your book centers around DC Stevenson, and he's a chilling figure in history. And you chose to make him the center of your book, the central character in your book, in addition to the person who eventually took him down. But you did have to write a book about a deeply morally bankrupt character.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how you approached that and what you hoped readers would take away from it.
Yeah, so I've written 10 books. This is my 10th book. I've never had a villain at the center of the book until now. And, when you write a book, you have to live, especially when you're writing history, you live in the era for about 3 years.
Yeah.
Time travel. And I just, I get out of, 2024 and I go live in 1924. And I deeply immerse myself in there. I try to understand the slang of the day, the music people listen to, the food they listen to, how they made love, what their sporting events were. I try to do all the social characters so I can bring it to life. And in Stevenson, the Grand Dragon, the monster at the center of this book, the son of a bitch I had to live with for 3 years, I found one of the most awful human beings I've ever spent time with. No, let me erase that. The most awful human being I've ever spent a lot of time with. But here's the other. He's also an American archetype. He's the con man. So this guy grows up in Oklahoma, poor. He's ashamed of his mother because she wore these bedraggled house dresses, and he would start dressing fancy even as a teenager. And he didn't want to be around his mother because look at her, she was poor white trash. I don't want to be associated with that. So he goes and marries young, has a child, ditches the woman, ditches the child, says, don't even try to find me. And he disappears, which you could do 100 years ago, into the fog of American life. He bounces around from town to town, trying to make a living. He's very good with words. He's brilliant and here's what he could do. He could make you think that your problems were not your fault, that it was somebody else's fault, that you were failing because of them, the them being all the people I've named before, that you have anxiety because of them. So he bounces around from town to town, silken voiced, raging alcoholic, by the way, preaching temperance and prohibition, he's shit-faced drunk before noon, and he's preaching the Klan virtues of, outlaw every single ounce of alcohol in the state of Indiana. And he's finds early on, I mentioned that he bribed these ministers. He'd been a failure at everything else, but within 2 years, he's a millionaire because every county in Indiana, after a while, forms a Klan did. And they have to pay $10 a person, which is a lot of money then. I looked it up. It was equal to a week's wage for your average worker, paying a week's wages to join the Klan. And he got the biggest cut of it. So he's a millionaire on this oldest of American things, which is a con man. He holds these rallies. He's blaming the others for all our problems. And I hate to use this line, but it's true. He's hearkening back to, we've got to make America great again. The great in the 1920s is to go back to the 1870s. So the number one thing the Klan wants to do, they got prohibition. That was check. They got Jim Crow, check. The number one thing they wanted was an immigration law that made it incredibly hard for these Jews, these Eastern Europeans, God forbid Africans, Asians, or anyone else. But they got the 1924 immigration law passed, which was on the books for more than 50 years. And the whole design of that law was to make America look like it did in the 1870s. So this wave of people who I mentioned who'd come in the first part of the 20th century, and by the way, deeply enriched this country. I mean, we wouldn't even have our Christmas songs without the Jewish songwriter. White Christmas, the most popular song of all time, was written by a Jewish songwriter. We wouldn't have so much of our culture. We wouldn't have Hollywood without this wave of immigrants who came from Eastern Europe, Jewish immigrants primarily, and gave us our culture. Black jazz, which was one of our greatest exports to the world, came about in the 1920s, and the Klan fought that. So, but back to Stevenson. So he was really a good con man, and then after a while, he became like the Wizard of Oz. He wouldn't allow himself to be seen. He would issue these statements, and he called himself the old man, even though he was 33 years old. The old man has spoken, and he would issue these things. So he became ever more mysterious and mythic, and highlight. And this was really hard for me because I later went back to this town of Kokomo, Indiana, which is on the surface a perfect American town. A little church steeple, a covered bridge, the corn stalks on the edge, a charming main street. In that town, on the 4th of July, 1923, the largest Klan rally in the history of the world, 200,000 people turned out from 5 states. Children, they had a Ku Klux Kiddies, by the way. That was one of his inventions. Women, many women, some of whom had been in the suffragette movement. And he enlisted women for white supremacy. He said, God, they've got the vote now. Let's enlist them on behalf of white supremacy. 200,000 people turn out in Kokomo, Indiana. And D.C. Stevenson drops from the sky in this Klan plane with the letters KKK on the bottom of the plane. He comes down, he bounces on the field. He gets out, he's got these purple robes on, and they all bow down to him like he's God. And some people start throwing money at him. So he had a cult, definitely had a cult. And his aide was just laugh. He says, look at these stupid rubes. Look what they're doing. They made fun of him. But Stevenson had this connection to them. And that was the highlight. The coda to that day, the sad coda, largest rally in the history of the Klan, was that night he rapes a girl in Kokomo and gets away with it. And it was the first of a series of sexual assault. I don't know, in fact, it was the first. It was one of a series of sexual assaults. He got, as this is the weird thing, this is like a fairy tale, a bad fairy tale. As Indiana became darker, ever more Klan, ever more, he became darker and ever more monstrous. So he sexually assaulted women, and then he chewed on them as well. He was a total monster.
Yeah. Bad company for 3 years.
Bad company, but the guy ran the state.
Yeah.
I tried to answer this question, and I'm not sure I succeeded. Because I couldn't quite. Why do we fall for people like that? And you ask the relevance for today. Why do we fall for someone we know is a con man? Why do we fall for someone we know is a liar? Why do we fall for someone who wants us to attack a third of our fellow citizens? I mean, what is it in us? I don't think it's unique to Americans. I mean, certainly fascism has risen everywhere you can point a dart at in the world to find some of this. But why are we, a country that's formed in the Enlightenment era thought, why are we susceptible to this?
Yeah. And I think seeing the rhyme now, the infuriating thing is that we can see the rhyme, but we can't necessarily explain why it keeps happening.
Correct. That's well put.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of point back to your comment about the suffragettes.
Mhm.
In the book, it's made clear that the Klan used community organizing methods to build its power base.
Right.
And I think it is something that I think on the left we like to think that we own community organizing, and it's simply not true. So is there anything are there lessons that can be learned from those tactics that they used, either cautionary or strategic, that could be applied to countering hate movements today?
Yeah, I mean, what you said is accurate. I mean, leftists don't own community organizing. This was brilliant community organizing because he started from the ground up.
Yeah.
He went from county to county. And he had, this poison squad. We think we're so rife with information now. He was very proud, this Stevenson, of what he called his poison squad. He would plant a rumor at the top of the state, say in South Bend, and he bragged that and the rumor would be something like this: 3 blacks have moved into this town, name the town, or so and so's store is owned by a Jew, and we want you to boycott it. And he would plant that rumor in the morning. And by the end of the day, every one of those 92 counties in Indiana would have spread it through his poison squad. And his poison squad was made up of women. Women were the spreaders. And that was one of their duties, was to spread this awfulness. Now, you mentioned the suffragettes. It was hard for me as a historian to see that people who had just given women the vote, not all of them certainly, and many of them fought the Klan. So let's be clear about that. But certainly a lot of them were willing, ready, enthusiastic joiners of women for the Klan. Now, they couldn't join the Klan because it was an all-male group, but he started this women's brigade. Have you looked through the book and seen the pictures of them? They're
Yeah.
with their little kids and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's an awful thing. And then they would take their little 9 and 10 and 11-year-olds and go into these dens and learn to hate. So, I mean, I think we sometimes put on blinders to think, oh, the awfulness of hate only affects one side. It does not. It affects anyone who's vulnerable to it. So he had taken people who were in the vanguard of one of our greatest social movements, that is giving the other half of Americans who didn't have the vote, and enlisted them in this awfulness.
Yeah. To your point, though, not all of the suffragettes, not all of women fell victim to this. And I think that we've spent plenty of time talking about awful men, and I'd really love to talk about Madge.
Yeah.
So the title of the book highlights the woman who stopped them, and Madge is like her courage in opposition to this is really central to the narrative. And I think that I'm curious how you approached balancing the importance of Madge's individual actions and individual bravery with the systemic resistance to the Klan that also existed simultaneously.
Yeah, again, a great question. Now, let me just talk about the systemic resistance. I talked about these guardrails that all failed. I mean, there was a very brave editor in Muncie, Indiana, named George Dale, little guy who was 5 foot, who figured this thing out early on. And he alerted people like 5-alarm fire. He goes, holy cow, they have taken over the police department, the judiciary, the state legislature. And he said, wake up, folks, we're becoming he was a Klan republic, which they were. And what happened? A Klan judge threw him in jail. There was no habeas corpus. And he was ordered to a labor farm. And when the Chicago Tribune later tried to figure this whole thing out, they said the Constitution didn't apply in the state of Indiana, because you can't do that. You have to, what was his crime? The crime that you commit every day, free speech.
Yeah.
That was his crime. And they threw him in jail. So they'd failed. Judiciary, half of them were Klansmen. There was a Klan judge who threw him in. The Catholic Church tried, through Notre Dame, where there was a riot of students, but ultimately failed. They had a newspaper called Tolerance, which was run by a rabbi, an African-American publisher, and an Irish-American lawyer. I know that sounds like a three guys walking a bar joke,
A little bit, yeah.
but once a week they would print the names, because they had a source on the inside, of thousands of people in the community who belonged to the secret organization. And the headline was always, "Who's Who in Bed Sheets." And they thought, oh, we'll dox them. We'll ask them, we'll show people who they are, and this will kill the Klan because they're the invisible empire. It was just the opposite. It was validating, because people looked at it and said, oh, I know that person. Oh yeah, that's my minister, that's my lawyer, that's my baker. So it was validating. So to Madge, the institutions had failed. Now it falls to one woman who didn't set out to bring down the Klan. She was a perfect woman of her age. And in deference to Sarah, who introduced us, she was in charge of the state literacy program. And that job was on the chopping block. Madge was also a flapper. She didn't feel like she had to get married. She drove bravely when it was a big deal across the country with her friend. And before there was a Lincoln Highway or anything like that, she's a very feisty, independent woman who just was living the age for all the freedoms that were available to women. But her literacy program was on the block. And so in order to save her job, she had to go to the guy who ran the state. Now, before I tell you what happened, and I'm going to use some hedge language here because I don't like to spoil the story, it's important to know that a few other good things happened. Jazz was basically invented, recorded jazz, on the same day that the Klan threw their biggest ever rally in Richmond, Indiana, 40,000 Klansmen with the plane and the torches and the whole thing. Louis Armstrong cut the first black jazz record in that town. And then his 9-member band got on the train and got the hell out of town. So I like to point out there was a little bit of life going on while all this stuff. So Madge doesn't set out to do this, but she goes, and when you write histories, you kind of get intoxicated by the major players, the big people who move the event. Yeah. I'm also always interested in people at the margins. And Madge is one of the people at the margins. She never would have her place in history. She still deserves her place in history. There's a little plaque outside of Noblesville where the trial is, but I said at the end of the book, she deserves a much bigger role. She goes to see this guy. He creeps her out. And over several months, he asks her out. And she feels like, again, she has to sort of play along to get her job back. And then one night he kidnaps her and he puts her on a train and they go to Chicago, and he's got one of his goons with him, and he commits a monstrous act of sexual violation. He rapes and attacks her and basically leaves her for dead. He chews her. So these got infections all over her body. And she makes her way back home after several days, and she's in bed and she's got a terrible fever and pus all over her body. And no one had ever gone to the police before because he owned the police. What he used to say is, I am the law. And what a statement. Napoleon used to say, L'État est moi. But this guy said, I am the law, and he was the law. So none of his other victims went to the cops. But she's lying on her deathbed, and she decides, I'm going to try to bring this bastard down. So she's dying, though. And the story gets out that Madge Oberholzer of Irvington, Indiana, is laying on her deathbed, and she's been raped and assaulted by the Grand Dragon, the guy running the state. So it's page one story every day that she lives, and it's attracting national attention too. And alone among all those women, she decides to write out what he did to her. So she writes this 10-page sort of deathbed soliloquy of what he did. And her words, I'm spoiling the story, her words beyond the grave ultimately bring this guy and the Klan down in Indiana. So I mentioned to you off the air that I went to Irvington, Indiana, where Madge is from, and spoke in a church 4 blocks from her house. And there's 1,000 people there, and they're all celebrating her life. Here we are 100 years later. And we sort of brought her back to life. And we gave her her due for what she'd done.
Yeah. Talk about the importance of believing women.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
And one woman, by the way, Stevenson said to her when she was, before he dumped her off at her house, she spent 24 hours in this hotel room where he was horrible. And he said, "You can't go to the cops, not only because I am the law, but because you're a nobody.
Yeah.
You're nothing. You don't exist. You have no power. You're a single woman in 1920s Indiana. I'm the law." So not only was it a lone woman, but it was a woman supposedly without power.
it's really stunning to imagine what it took
Right.
to claim that power.
Right. And Hannah, she was an accidental heroine too. Again, she didn't set out to try to, circumstances thrust her in that situation.
Absolutely. So I'm really curious. One of the things that I have to imagine as a challenge in this kind of work is researching a period in history when the Klan was the power, and was empowered to whitewash its legacy. And I'm curious what challenges you encountered with that and how you overcame them.
Well, this is something that went into the American memory hole and remained deeply buried.
Yeah.
I've brought a lot of it out. The book's sold very well. It just disappeared from time. It was just like, now in Indiana, they acted like it never happened. And I say at the end of the book, about 10 years ago, somebody found this chest in a barn in Noblesville where the trial had happened, Indiana, and they opened up the chest, and there was a list of 10,000 people in this charming little town who belonged to the Klan. And people were freaking out. Like, oh my God, Grandpa was a Klansman. You know what they did? They decided to close the chest back up and lock it for another 10 years.
Yeah.
People couldn't see it. Now, when I was doing my research, it had been recently opened. I had to go through hoops just to see this, though, a lot of it. So it's really hard because you open up, and this is the golden age of newspapers. So like every town had a daily. Indiana probably had 5 daily newspapers. You cannot open up a newspaper and see anything but Klan headlines. Most of them praiseworthy. I mean, one of the newspapers ran a regular column called Klan Comment, which was on all the verities and virtues of the Klan.
Oh,
They would have,
yeah.
like the same thing that would advertise the chicken lunch that was going to happen would advertise the Klan meeting. It was just ho hum. So it was just amazing to me, Hannah, that you could open up any newspaper and these banner headlines would pop out, and then none of us had heard about it. I like to think I'm pretty well informed. I used to roam all over America writing stories. I'd never heard about any of this. Now, in our own backyard, I have to say, there was a Klan rally in Issaquah in 1924, their pivotal year, that attracted 15,000 people. And during that same time, the Grand Dragon, who was touring America, was feted to a big luncheon by the Chamber of Commerce in downtown Seattle. Then he goes to Tacoma, and the Masons host him for a big rally. So, and I mentioned Oregon. So, I like to think, I won't speak for others, that the Pacific Northwest is different. That because of our being on the far edge, we don't go down some of these lanes. But we certainly welcomed the Klan. We never embraced them on the degree that Oregon, Colorado, and Indiana did.
Yeah, but it is important to, I think that we do ourselves a disservice in terms of understanding what the Klan actually was if we perpetuate the myth that it was always somewhere else. And I
Right.
think
And
that's what
that's
we really want to do.
and the other point I want to make on this is that if today somebody called a press conference anywhere in the United States with a hood and a robe on and announced, "I'm the Grand Dragon of the so-and-so Indiana or so-and-so Klan," and I hear it, they'd be run out of town, they'd be mocked, they'd be this. But if today someone called a press conference and said some of the same themes
Right.
that the Klan promoted, mainly about immigrants, it wouldn't, almost word for word, you can look in the book at the words they used. The person wouldn't have a robe on, they wouldn't have a hood on, they wouldn't be veiled with their little eye cutouts, but they would be saying some of the same things, and there would be lots of people at a rally to welcome them for that.
Yeah,
The only difference is they weren't wearing the robe.
Yeah, I think that kind of leads into the last question I wanted to ask you, which is about kind of everyday citizens. I mean, you talked about this at the top that, the Klansmen were your lawyer, your doctor, your
Yeah.
the guy, your butcher. Um, and you really do detail how everyday citizens and institutions were complicit in the rise of the Klan. And I'm curious how you think we should confront that, I think, inherently uncomfortable reality in our modern times.
Yeah, and that's what we're struggling with right now, post-election. I don't think it does us any good to vilify them and say they're all stupid and ignorant and racist. I think
Mhm.
that just makes you more of a minority side. I think it's important to understand what's driving the fear, what's driving the hatred. And some of the really good people in the 20s tried to do that. And they did switch some people over. Um, but I think all it does is fortify them by saying, oh, they're all stupid idiots, racist, dumb fucks, I'm sorry. uh, all stupid, ignorant people. And I just don't think that helps. I think you have to understand what's at the core there. And at the core is what you said 22 minutes ago. Fear, fear, fear that your comfortable life is going to somehow be challenged by these others. And so if you understand that, I mean, that's again one of the things I try to dial down. One more thing I hadn't mentioned, just on the enormity of this Klan.
Yeah.
They were 6 million people. 6 million people joined the Klan by 1924, and they were going to have 12 million by 1928. That's what the projections were. And they were going to run for president. They were going to run a Klansman for president. They so dominated, I have this in the book, and you can look it up, the 1924 national political conventions of both the Democrats and the Republicans, that Time magazine put the Grand Dragon on its cover after the conventions and wrote a largely praiseworthy story about this dominant group that's now controlling both parties. So they were on a march to run a Klansman for president by 1928. They had 75 members of Congress. 75 members of Congress were sympathetic, not sworn members, but sympathetic. They had 3 governors who were sworn members and 4 United States senators. So the enormity of this thing, it wasn't a one-off. It wasn't a little small thing. We had a really close call. They were this close, but for Madge Oberholzer, their march to the White House. Speaking of march, in 1924, they had a rally in Washington, D.C. 50,000 people marched right down the center of the Capitol.
Well, thank you so much. Are we ready to pivot into uh, audience questions?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Yeah.
So I would like to kick it off and then send, so folks, please put your questions in the chat as they arise. But just a sort of two-part question for you. As a librarian by trade, I'm really fascinated by both research process and storytelling. And I feel like that's something your work really it's really strong in both of those places, right? So if you could talk a little bit about your research process, uh, is it a lot in person? Is it a lot in online archives, that sort of thing? But also sort of your origins. And I think I've read that maybe some of your storytelling chops come from your family. And so if you could talk about those like kind of two sides of your work.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. I come from the Irish storytelling tradition, tiny island nation that has 1 million writers, 1 million songwriters, 1 million artists. Storytelling goes deep, deep in our DNA. I come from a large family too, so you had to tell a story to be able to compete for attention. I'm also a journalist, and I love doing research because of the serendipitous things that happen, the things you sort of stumble upon. You think you're going to look for one thing, and then you find something fantastic, like the fact that Louis Armstrong cut the first jazz record. You know, thank God for librarians in the state of Indiana. They almost alone preserve the story intact. The Indiana State Library and the Indiana Historical Association, I spent so many countless days reliving this awful period, and it's all there. I say to people, this story isn't hidden. You just have to know where to look for it. It's there. It's documented. So my job was to find the narrative. Now you touched on that. You know, there are a lot better historians than I. There's a lot better researchers than I. But I always look for a compact story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and hopefully a larger tail to it. I mean, something of larger resonance. So I'm going along, I'm looking at all this stuff, and then I start to see storytelling arcs. Oh my God. And then I find Madge Oberholzer and I go, wonderful. I have some positive, even though an awful thing happened to her, I have some positive outcome. So I'm looking for storytelling arcs. I'm looking for a way to tell this history that attracts the largest audience. And how do you do that? Drama, tension, surprise, twists. All the last third of this book is a trial. And you may be surprised at this. My model was just a John Grisham book. I mean, I just wanted it to be, I had all the transcripts, I had all the newspaper accounts. I just wanted to lay it out and let the reader, you know, what's going to happen. So in order to get people to bite on this awful history, I had to tell a good story. And the way to do it is the research. I mean, I know writers who hire out their research. I would never do that in a million years. First of all, I love doing it. I really love time traveling. I love holding those old diary entries, those old letters, those old newspapers. It's just thrilling to me. And also that's where you find all the good stuff. Now, it's tedious. You go days and days and days where you don't find Jack, you know, and then bingo, something happens. So.
Thank you. We've got a question from the audience from Susie. As a journalist, how did you decide to write books? And how did you make the transition from shorter pieces to long form?
So it was, I always had a plan, actually. I went into journalism in order to write books. So I'm one of those people who's very lucky. I knew at a very young age, I actually knew when I was in third grade, when I was a little guy, I didn't get my growth spurt till really late. And, you know, I went up in front of the class in third grade and the teacher asked us to read a poem we'd written. And I read this poem and afterward, you know, all these girls came up to me and I felt really, you know, empowered because my little poem had given me something. So, you know, I was plotting, how do you become a writer? Well, there's a couple different avenues, but I thought the best way was to mix it up in the world through journalism. You know, cover cops and trials and fires and trauma and joy and sorrow and all the sort of mishigas of daily life exposes me to humanity. So it was a means to an end. I became a journalist so I could write books. And my very first book, The Good Rain, about the Northwest, God, 30 years ago, was when I was just been hired by the Northwest and I was looking at our region as an outsider, trying to think, you know, what makes us different? So yeah, the journalism was a way to get to it. And I'm so lucky in that, you know, I learned some great techniques from great journalists and it's carried over. One more thing on that. When I was doing my Dust Bowl book, The Worst Hard Time, I sat around in these little towns in the, you know, Great Plains with women in their 90s, almost all women, because their husbands were dead. And they have lived through the worst environmental disaster of our history, the dirty 30s. And all I did was let them talk. And no one had ever asked them in many, many years, because this Dust Bowl was a distant thing. People had stopped asking about them and they'd stopped talking about it. And boom, it was like, you know, just a series of Christmas lights popped because they just wanted to talk because everyone wants to tell their story.
Thank you. Well, one final question for you. And I know sometimes you can't always, so hopefully you can. Can you tell us what you're working on next? And are you in that deep research phase where you take a couple years doing that?
I can and I will. Thank you for asking. Again, I'm really lucky to find these stories and I don't ever plan them. I'm just open. I always say you got to be open to serendipity. And I got a letter from a woman probably about 3 years ago. She'd read the Dust Bowl book and she said, did you ever you ought to look into what happened in Fort Concho, Texas, in 1877. And I look it up and I said, oh, the fort was entirely inhabited by Black soldiers, Black cavalrymen, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 1870s, 1880s. And the officer there was the first Black graduate of West Point. A guy named Henry Flipper was the first Black officer in the American Army. And I looked at all this history that he'd lived in just a 5-year period. He goes from Reconstruction to in the height of the Indian Wars with the Comanche and the Apache, and all this turmoil, all this change, the worlds are changing is going on. And so I've got great history, but then I've also got an insight into his mind because he left behind 2 wonderful memoirs. One was called The Colored Cadet, and the other was called The Negro Frontiersman. So I've got a portal into my character. So I'm writing a Western about a Buffalo soldier at the end of all the change and the trauma in the 400 years of wars with Native people. Does that sound interesting?
Wow. And that's historical fiction? Is it?
No, it's
nonfiction.
History. Yeah.
Okay.
By the way, he was born enslaved too, and his father had to buy his mother to hold the family together. So you get slavery, you get the wars, you get Reconstruction, all in his life.
Do you know when it's coming out?
Fiction. Hopefully not fiction.
God willing. Do you know when it's coming out?
No, I mean, I haven't started to write. I've been traveling, spending a lot of time in Texas where he was, New Mexico, Arizona. I just came back from Georgia where he was enslaved, walked around the grounds where his family was enslaved and kind of absorbed all that, the cotton fields of southern Georgia. And then I spent a week at West Point where he was the first Black officer. And so I'm trying to, it goes to your earlier question, how I do these things. I try to read everything, but then I do the sort of research by walking around so that I can describe the area, what it was like stuff. Yeah.
Some of the best parts of reporting is just taking it in.
Yeah. Don't you think so?
Absolutely.
That's the way I feel. That's exactly the way I feel. I mean, you can only read so much stuff in the library, and then you just got to go out and throw yourself in it.
Yeah, there's something to the details that you can add by being there, physically
Absolutely.
being there, that you can never recreate.
Well put. Absolutely. I mean, so like in the Dust Bowl, I couldn't describe these winds if I hadn't been knocked down by them myself. You absolutely put yourself in the middle of it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you both so much. Really appreciate hearing you both in conversation. Timothy, congratulations again on your Washington State Book Award and all of the success of this book. And thank you for spending your evening with us. So glad the power held out in our own little windstorm.
I had a lot of blinking, and I could look out and see that the power's out in the neighborhood below me, but it spared my neighborhood.
Wow.
So
Awesome.
it did knock out my entire neighborhood below me.
Wow, that's some luck.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Hannah, thank you for filling in. You did a great job. Marcus, we miss you, love you. We'll see you again in and around the turn. And thanks to everyone in Washington State for selecting this book. I've won a lot of awards, but none means more to me than the Washington Book Award, believe me. So thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.